Alright everyone, hello and welcome to the final screencast for Chapter 5. This is the 6th screencast, and in this screencast we're going to look at a specific type of price floor, the minimum wage. The minimum wage is by far the most famous price floor because it's often a big hot button political issue. But here we're just going to try to take a look at the economics of the minimum wage. And so what we're going to see is, as you can imagine, there are a lot of unintended consequences of the minimum wage. At least theoretically, it's possible. I'm going to discuss some of the actual studies that have been done on the minimum wage at the end, but first we'll work through some of the theoretical predictions about the minimum wage. Okay, so the minimum wage is the lowest hourly wage rate that firms may legally pay their workers for. It functions as a price floor. All right. So the rationale for it is to provide a living wage, or just provide a kind of good wage. It may not be a living wage even, but for people who work in these industries that tend to pay really low wages. The idea is to help the working poor who are often doing unskilled labor. All right. So labor markets are a little bit different than the normal supply and demand we did for goods and services. So with goods and services, consumers, that's all of us, all of you, we're the demanders of the goods, and the firms are the suppliers of the goods. All right. Well, in a labor market, the supply and demand is kind of flipped. Consumers, all of us, we're the suppliers of labor. We are actually the ones who supply our labor in the labor market, and firms are actually the demanders in the labor market. So everything else is really the same. We analyze things in the same way with the supply and demand, but it's important to remember that now we're the suppliers of the labor, and firms are actually the demanders. Okay, so on the axis of a graph for the labor market, we usually call the price the wage. All right, wage is the price of labor, and the quantity of labor is on the horizontal axis. So this is the number of workers. All right, so here we have the typical supply and demand diagram. Remember, price is now called the wage, and the quantity is just the quantity of labor down here at the bottom. All right. So the equilibrium wage, say in this particular labor market, is $10. All right. It's just like we did with our other supply and demand diagram. All right. Yeah. Now the label shows up there, the quantity of minimum wage workers. Okay. So what a price floor, the minimum wage would be to say that you can't pay less than $7 an hour. Now here, this is a non-binding price floor, right? This won't have any effect because the equilibrium price for labor, the equilibrium wage, is above this minimum wage, all right? So the demand curve for labor is downward sloping. Firms are willing to buy more labor at low wages, all right? Just like we as consumers, when we're the demand curve, want to buy more stuff if the price is low. Firms, if the price of labor, if the wage is low, they want to buy more. If the wage is high, they want to buy less. A simple supply curve for labor is also upward sloping. Individuals are willing to supply more labor at higher wages. More people are willing to work at higher wages. Less labor at lower wages. Less people are willing to work at lower wage. All right. So with a binding minimum wage, here's our supply and demand. Again, our equilibrium is at $10. The old minimum is at $7. But now we're going to have so all of these transactions are illegal, but that's fine. It doesn't really matter. It's non-binding. All these transactions are legal. Now there's a new minimum wage at $12, okay? So now all of these transactions are illegal. They're not allowed to happen. These transactions are legal, and so what we're going to get is we're going to get a quantity demanded of labor that is going to be below the quantity supplied of labor. All right, so here is the quantity demanded of labor by firms, the quantity supplied of labor by people. So this is a surplus, and we call a surplus of labor unemployment. There are people who are willing and able to work jobs who now cannot find jobs because there are less jobs demanded than there are the supply of jobs in the market. All right. So what happens to minimum wages in the long run? What do they do in the long run to that surplus of labor? Well, again, supply and demand get more elastic in the long run. Here I've got a equilibrium of $7 an hour, and the minimum wage is $10. All right. So what happens is over time, so there's the surplus, that's the unemployment. Over time, supply gets more elastic, demand gets more elastic, and we see that surplus, the long run unemployment, actually gets worse. So the minimum wage can actually exacerbate the very problem it was intended, well, not the problem it was intended to help, it was intended to help poorer people find jobs, but what it can do is it can cause unemployment to be worse, meaning it's harder and harder for those type of people to find, for people in unskilled or low-skilled jobs to find jobs, all right? So the unintended consequences of a binding minimum wage is unemployment. It's caused by a decrease in quantity demanded for labor, an increase in the quantity supplied. Firms will replace low-skilled jobs with capital. They'll turn to machines, if at all possible. They might outsource. They might go to another state, go to another country, go somewhere where labor is cheaper. Relocate the country. Shorten hours for workers, right? If make workers work harder in shorter bursts of time in order to pay less because you're paying more by the hour. Proponents of a minimum wage would advocate that there should also be training, education, job programs, all sorts of other things to go along with a minimum wage. So what about the politics of it? Well, politically, raising a non-binding wage floor seems caring and benevolent, and it doesn't really have any effect. So if, say the going equilibrium wage in San Jose for unskilled labor was $10, if San Jose wanted to pass one that was $6 or $7, you get all the good feeling of passing this thing, but it doesn't really have any effect. Raising a non-binding wage floor will have no effects. All right. States with the highest binding minimum wages have some of the highest unemployment. So we do see a correlation between having a high minimum wage and unemployment. All right, at least just in that correlation. Places like Washington, Oregon, and California. What is the empirical evidence on the minimum wage? So in the U.S., it's true that states with high minimum wages have high unemployment, but for the most part, most of the empirical tests on the effect of the minimum wage show little to no effect on unemployment. All right. So what's going on? Our theoretical model predicts that this is going to exacerbate unemployment. Well, the problem, the reason we don't see much of an effect is that the minimum wage change in the U.S. are usually really, really small compared to fluctuations in other inputs that firms have. So if you raise the minimum wage, say 50 cents, that is a big increase in cost to firms, but a lot of the other inputs into whatever goods and service they produce fluctuate more than that amount, and so we don't tend to see a very big effect on unemployment with increases in the minimum wage. All right. This is just to kind of sum up some of the things we've done in the chapter, how to remember what's a price floor and what's a price ceiling. All right. So if the equilibrium price is P star, equilibrium quantity is Q star, then a price that is a mandated price that is below the equilibrium, all right, would be a price ceiling. You're not allowing the price to go to the equilibrium. You're saying this is the maximum price we will allow. That is a binding price ceiling. A binding price floor would say the price cannot go below this amount, and so the binding price floor needs to be above the equilibrium. People often get this confused when they just try to memorize it, because notice the binding price floor is above the equilibrium, the binding price ceiling is below, but that's because that's where they constrain. The floor only constrains you if you're trying to go below it. The ceiling only constrains you if you're trying to go above it, all right? So, in conclusion, prices act as signals, and they give information to consumers and producers. Price controls distort those signals, and so for the most part, economists are not big fans of price controls. Price control policy has to be done with caution because there's lots of unintended consequences. There are plenty of economists who want to help unskilled labor, want to help poor people, want to help the less fortunate, but for the most part, economists don't like the idea of messing with prices, because prices serve a really important function in the economy. So you'll see a lot of economists say they would rather just see cash transfers to people rather than messing with prices, because prices do a lot of other good things for us in the economy.